Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Oge Onobogo, and I am the director of the Wilson Center's Africa program. I want to welcome all of you for joining us for this event today on Africa's growing cities, as we explore the challenges and opportunities in a conversation with Honorable Geordin Hill-Lewis, the mayor of the city of Cape Town, South Africa. The Wilson Center Africa program, for those of you who are not familiar with the Africa program, works to address some of the most critical issues facing U.S.-Africa relations. Our work helps to inform policy that helps to build stronger and mutually beneficial U.S.-Africa relations. And most importantly, we work to enhance the knowledge and understanding about Africa in the United States. For this conversation today, I also want to acknowledge our co-sponsors, the Wahaba Institute for Strategic Competition and the Environmental Change and Security Program, both programs here at the Wilson Center. This conversation today has garnered a lot of interest, and I understand that we have over 300 RSVPs, so we're looking forward to the discussion. Now I would like to introduce Ambassador Mark Green, the President and CEO of the Wilson Center. Ambassador Green has a long and distinguished career, which includes serving as Administrator of USAID, President of the International Republican Institute, Executive Director of the McCain Institute, President of the Initiative of Global Development, and U.S. Ambassador to Tanzania. Ambassador, I'm going to pass it over to you now. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Oge, very much. Good afternoon and good evening, everyone, whether you're joining us from here in the U.S. or anywhere around the world online. And of course, a very special welcome to our featured guest, the Mayor of Cape Town. You know, it was Congress itself that established the Wilson Center some 5 decades ago for the purpose, in their words, of strengthening the fruitful relation between the world of learning and the world of public affairs. That means while other institutions may deal in opinions and advocacy, we're scholarship-driven. We're fiercely independent and fiercely nonpartisan. Our special status brings with it, I think, some special obligations to not duplicate what others are doing, but instead to prioritize the most important issues and opportunities, places where we think we can add value or make a difference, all of which makes Wilson the right place for today's discussion. As we talk about one of the most pressing issues for Africa, its rapid growth and urbanization. By 2050, Africa's population will double to 2.5 billion, 1/4 of the world's population. 70% of that growth is expected to happen in cities like Lagos, Kinshasa, Mombasa, and Cape Town, who will see their populations triple. By 2100, 10 out of the world's 20 largest cities will be on the African continent. These growing cities represent opportunities as well for Africa and the US to bring the power of innovation and private entrepreneurship to bear. Africa is the youngest continent. Its people are aspirational and hungry for their chance to help shape the future. The Wilson Center is eager to be a partner in this process, to try to suggest ways in which the U.S. can help African leaders realize their goals in infrastructure development, effective and affordable energy, and private enterprise-driven job growth. Today, we will discuss challenges faced by rapidly growing municipalities, from infrastructure development and governance to investment and creating safer cities, by looking at one city in particular, Cape Town. As the son of a South African with cousins in Cape Town and having spent many happy days and weeks there, I know that Cape Town is one of the most beautiful cities in the world. It's also one of the most vibrant and one of the most private enterprise driven. Even more, as an unabashed Africa enthusiast, some would say Africa nut, I firmly believe this is Africa's time on the global stage. I believe that we in the US shouldn't be bystanders, but close friends and essential partners. Today's event will illuminate some of the ways to do just that. I now have the pleasure of introducing to you our guest, Cape Town's Mayor, Geordin Hill-Lewis. In 2021, he was sworn in as Cape Town's youngest ever executive mayor. He is a member of the Democratic Alliance, or DA party. In 2011, he was elected to South Africa's National Assembly as its youngest MP at 24 years old. He served on the oversight committees for public service and administration and trade and industry. He has an honors degree in politics, philosophy, and economics from the University of Cape Town and earned a master's degree in finance, specializing in economic policy from London University. With that, I'm honored to welcome Mr. Mayor. Please come to the virtual podium and join us. You're welcome.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm really honored by the invitation. Thank you to you, Ambassador Green. It's a pleasure to meet you, and I'm so sorry that we couldn't meet in person as a result of this of the snow day, which is quite a novelty for a Cape Townian. Ambassador Green, who has spent much time in our city, will tell you that we have never, ever, not once in my whole life, had a snow day. So it's great to be here to soak up the atmosphere. And to you as well, Ms. Onubogu, and to the rest of the leadership of the Woodrow Wilson Center, thank you again for extending the invitation. And to all of the guests who have joined online, thank you for giving up your time to listen to a mayor of a city halfway around the world. You know, it's great to be in Washington, truly one of the great cities of the world, and obviously for a political junkie like myself, it couldn't be more exciting to be here in Washington, even if the weather has forced some of our engagements online. And in the city that is really at the center of the political universe, it's a particular privilege to spend some time this afternoon with a distinguished audience of well-informed, interested people who care deeply about the power of politics to deliver social progress. That is really the point. That is why I am in politics, and it's great to be able to discuss that with you. You, like me, are interested in examples of governments around the world delivering real development and improvements in the human condition, which is the actual point of being in government. And you, like me, are undoubtedly concerned about our collective future, as the ambassador has said in his introduction, and what that means for what we have to do and the decisions we must take now, and what we can do now to make sure that that future is better and more sustainable. If you share those interests, as I know that you do, then I want to tell you and point you towards a bright and hopeful light on the geopolitical map, the city that I am proud and privileged to be the mayor of, right at the southern tip of Africa. Now, as a disclaimer, I know that some here, especially the ambassador, are very deep and committed friends of Cape Town and may have friends and family there and may have visited many times, and you probably know most of what there is to know. But I must also assume that there are some here who have joined us today who are not so dialed into what is happening in South Africa or in Cape Town, and so some context may be helpful to you. And I'll give you some context right now. So let me tell you a little bit about my incredible city. Cape Town is perched at the southwestern tip of Africa, where two oceans meet around a beautiful and dramatic peninsula. And our city has long been a gateway into Africa. 370 years ago, quite a bit older than Washington, D.C., we were the first stop for fresh food and water for the crews of sailing ships traveling the arduous journey from Europe to the east and back, when this was the main trade route from west to east. Ironically, because of the disturbances and attacks in the Gulf, the Arabian Gulf at the moment, Cape Town is once again playing center stage in the global trade routes. From that tiny refreshment station 3.5 centuries ago, has grown a large modern metropolitan municipality, home now to 5 million people, and increasingly the first choice for global holidaymakers. We've just finished our peak holiday season and have smashed previous records for foreign visitors, including many hundreds of thousands of visitors from the United States. the first choice for event organizers and global sporting events, but also importantly for business investors who are coming to invest in our economy and or who are using it as a gateway for the rest of Africa. Like all South African cities and many cities of the developing world, Cape Town has to deal with major challenges. We have very high unemployment. We have very high poverty. We have high crime. We have housing shortages. We have energy insecurity. And we struggle to keep up with the pressure to provide and maintain sufficient public infrastructure. But unlike most other cities in the country, Cape Town is moving the dial. Excuse me. But unlike most other cities in the country, Cape Town is moving the dial positively on each of these issues. And for the remainder of my term in office, I intend to see that dial move in one direction only. I served previously as a member of parliament for my party, the Democratic Alliance, which is the official opposition nationally in South Africa, but which governs in several major cities and towns, and in one province, what you would call a state here in the United States. And I am now personally 2 years into a 5-year term of office as mayor of Cape Town, as the ambassador has said. I live with my wife and young daughter in the very same neighborhood where I grew up, a modest community just to the northwest of the city center, where I attended school, met my wife, made lifelong friends, and got my first taste of politics as a young election volunteer. In South Africa this year, we mark the 30th anniversary of our first democratic elections back in 1994, when I was just 7 years old, I must tell you. In just 4 or 5 months, South Africa faces this absolute watershed national election. In fact, I'm tempted to say, Ambassador and guests, that it might be the most important election taking place anywhere in 2024, although I'm sure you might argue with me on that point. But what makes this year's election seminal is that it will be the first time in 30 years that the outcome is genuinely impossible to predict ahead of time. As a young political activist for the opposition in South Africa, the only questions in every election we have fought thus far were, one, how big the ANC's win would be, and two, whether we could grow our previous result. But the overall result of the election was never in doubt. Now, for the first time, it is, and that is a really big deal. There is at the very least a potential scenario, what we economists would describe as a non-trivial probability, that South Africa could end up with a change in government for the first time in its democratic dispensation. And an even greater probability that even if the ANC is able to cling to government, that it will lose its majority and will need a coalition in order to govern. If you add to this fact that several previously fragmented opposition parties have now for the first time begun to coalesce under the banner of what we call the Moonshot Pact, following the convening efforts of the DA, and you understand just how much of a watershed this is. Finally, by way of context, is the fact that both the Western Cape Province and the Cape Town have had outright DA governments for a decade, which is long enough for meaningful differences in policies, budget allocations, and philosophical approaches to government to show up in performance. So that makes for a truly fascinating election prospect this year. Now, given all of that context, I see our mission in Cape Town as simple and powerful. It is this: we must demonstrate to Cape Townians and South Africans alike that the state can still be a force for good, delivering the context for foster economic growth, new jobs for more people, and improved lives. In short, amidst the widespread loss in South Africa, sadly, of the optimism that defined the mid and late 1990s, we in Cape Town must demonstrate that there is still a real prospect of more opportunity and a better future. In other words, what we call the City of Hope. To be the City of Hope, to deliver on this mission, we must deliver a growing economy in Cape Town. And we must use the dividends of that growing economy to deliver more dignified living conditions for those many residents still living in poverty. And we have many. And we must take actions now to properly prepare for Cape Town's future growth and success. And I loved what the ambassador said in the introduction, and we'll come to that in a minute. But let me say, in all of this, Cape Town is in a unique position. We have extremely solid city finances. We have a professional civil service, and we have the stability of an outright governing majority across multiple terms of office. We really are the only major city in South Africa that is truly able to plan for the future. We know that the Cape Town of 2040 or 2050, or indeed, as was mentioned, of 2100, will look very different, unrecognizable to the Cape Town of today, as population growth, and a word that I think we have coined in South Africa called semigration, and particularly urbanization, change our city dramatically. South Africa, as the ambassador said, is one of those rapidly urbanizing countries. In 1911, only around 18% of South Africa's population lived in cities. By 1950, that number had doubled to 35% and continued to rise rapidly despite every effort of the apartheid government, every malicious effort, should I say, of the apartheid government to suppress urbanization through the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. After our transition to democracy in 94, the rate of urbanization increased again when apartheid legislation around migration control and racially defined areas was removed. Today, a full 68% of South Africans already live in the cities, and this is rising rapidly every day. And the view is that by 2035, that number will be right up to 80%. Of course, that will be 80% of a much, much larger population as well, not 80% of today's population, putting huge pressure on cities like mine to keep up with the pace of urban growth. This is, of course, a trend that affects all South Africa's major cities, and indeed throughout Africa and the developing world. But what makes South Africa's urbanization challenges unique and especially difficult is the effect that apartheid legislation had on planning and spatial planning in particular in our cities. 30 years into our democracy, the spatial legacy of apartheid is still evident across South Africa, wherever you go, in all of our cities, with the poorest residential areas and sprawling informal settlements, or what we call townships, pushed far away from city centers and other economic hubs where job opportunities can be found. A lack of quality and affordable public transport options further isolates those areas and the people who live there, and keeps those people trapped in poverty across multiple generations. Already, people spend 30 to 40% in townships in South Africa on public transport just to get to vanishingly rare job opportunities. So repealing apartheid legislation was the easy part. Undoing the effects of half a century of apartheid and its spatial planning and its impact on our cities is far more challenging still. And progress over the past 30 years has been painfully slow. Unfortunately, there's no clear national government policy in South Africa to deal with the scale of urban growth. And as a result, municipalities have not managed to keep pace with the rapidly increasing demand for public services and housing, resulting in swelling informal settlements. With our transition to democracy 30 years ago, the responsibilities of city governments like mine were broadened extensively to better deal with this urban growth. And that's partly why I love being the mayor, because in the South African system, it is one of the most powerful and responsible positions at any level of government throughout the country. But despite all of that extra responsibility and impact, in most cases, a combination of political interference, weak leadership, and excessive central regulation from national government has hampered the ability of cities to deal with the impact of that spatial legacy. Unfortunately, in most cities, there's very little sign of long-term planning, of concerted efforts to undo the spatial legacy of apartheid, whether through more integrated communities, more housing, better use of land, or more efficient public transport. Despite all of these challenges, urbanization still pays off for most individuals and families in South Africa. And the data shows that clearly. A study published recently, just about 18 months ago or so, tracked the progress of 30,000 families in South Africa, and found that around 2/3 of those who had migrated or semigrated from rural to urban settings and who were poor when the study started in 2008 had managed to exit poverty after moving to the city. Even in an economy barely growing, as South Africa's has sadly underperformed over the last decade, these South Africans who had moved from rural to urban settings had still managed to find some kind of work by moving to the city. And so you can see why people are still doing this in record numbers. The contribution to this country's finances by cities is even more disproportionate, with South Africa's 3 most urbanized cities accounting for 3/4 of all tax paid in South Africa. Quite a staggering statistic. There is no doubt that our cities drive our economy, they drive the creation of jobs, and that people living in our cities are considerably more likely to escape poverty and find employment and build a better life than those still living in rural areas. So if we want to maximize this economic engine for our country, then this is where our future focus should be. And this again is why it is such a privilege to be a mayor, because I really do believe the future of Cape Town's and South Africa's prosperity and the prosperity of her people will be built in successful cities. In Cape Town, we have a very good idea of what our future is going to look like. Our country's latest census data, which we've just got recently in the last months, shows that Cape Town is now the very biggest city in the country by population numbers. We've now crossed over the size of Johannesburg, which has for the longest time been South Africa's biggest city. And there are now more than 5 million people in Cape Town. And we know that we will continue to rapidly grow as our city's track record for both job creation and economic opportunity and better public services make Cape Town more and more desirable. Within a generation, the numbers show Cape Town is going to be a metro of 10 million people plus. And this is something, that's why I love the topic of discussion today, because this has become something of a mantra in my team in the city. I always ask our planning team, our professionals, what are we doing today to prepare Cape Town for a city of 10 million people? Because it is coming sooner than we think. We think that is a huge opportunity. Some people may see it as a very daunting challenge, and of course it comes with its pressures. But if you are well prepared for the future, it can be an opportunity, and we choose to make it an opportunity. We believe that the growth of Cape Town, the doubling of Cape Town's population, has the potential to drive our economy and increase the prosperity of our residents, but only if we are well prepared. We have to buck the national trends, which has seen the steady neglect and decline of public infrastructure and public services in cities. We have to buck that. That is mainly as a result of chronic underinvestment in the expansion and maintenance of infrastructure, which has now left many cities in a state of some dysfunction. Sewage systems in many towns and cities are struggling to cope, and water outages are becoming more common in other parts of the country. Combined with our country's well-publicized energy supply crisis, these service delivery failures have left residents angry and frustrated. And that has contributed to that loss of the optimism of the late 90s that I spoke about earlier. So we have our work cut out for us to make sure that Cape Town is that city, that site, that light of hope. In those towns and cities struggling to manage the current demand, there is one defining feature, and that is what I call short-termism in political leadership, a failure to plan properly for the future. And increased urbanization in the years ahead will place even more burden on those infrastructure and public services. So we are determined to avoid that scenario. Our goal, our plan, is to look far down the road and prepare ourselves for what is coming. We are obsessed with what we call future-proofing our city through investment and decisions now. One of the very first things I did at the start of my term of office was to create a future planning and resilience department within the city. And I'm pleased that one of our directors from our future planning and resilience department, Mr. Hugh Cole, is on the line with us today. This is not just a small pet project. This is a major front and center project of our government. It reports directly to me as mayor and has become an integral part of everything that we do in the city. As a result of this obsessive future focus, we have embarked on the most ambitious infrastructure investment program ever undertaken in South Africa. At the moment, our infrastructure pipeline is running at $6.5 billion in the next 10 years and growing. I've just before this come from meetings this morning here in DC with the World Bank and the IFC, and we are constantly looking at ways to better finance that infrastructure so that we can expand it even further. We are ramping up our infrastructure spending every year, most specifically on water and sanitation infrastructure. And to give you an idea of the scale here, over the next 3 years, we are going to outspend and outinvest South Africa's other two biggest cities, Johannesburg and Durban, combined, more than both of those cities combined over the next 3 years. We've embarked on huge projects to upgrade wastewater capacity and deliver new sources of fresh water to our city so that we can protect ourselves from severe droughts as we had 4 or 5 years ago. You will have no doubt heard our recent scare that we had in 2018 and 17, a once-in-a-generation drought. And you will know how critical it is that we protect ourselves and secure our water sustainability for the future. And then, of course, we simply must deal with our energy security problem in South Africa. We know that we cannot wait around for the national government to fix those. We must do so ourselves. I'm sure by now you have heard of South Africa's deepening energy crisis. We have had rolling blackouts in our country since all the way back in 2007 and still have not resolved those. We euphemistically call these blackouts load shedding in an attempt to lend an air of normality to the practice, but they are not normal and they should never become normal. In fact, they have been disastrous for our country's economy. They are the single biggest thing holding back our country's economic growth, and so too for our city. But there has unfortunately been a stubborn ideological refusal by the national government to open up the market to the private sector and to end the monolithic state monopoly on the provision of electricity. We in Cape Town are determined to free ourselves from this anchor that is dragging the city economy down, and to be the first city in the country to ease these rolling blackouts and finally to end them. We have already made some good progress in easing them, such that the lowest number of blackouts in South Africa are now in Cape Town, but we have some way to go before we can end them altogether. We've done that by seeking to buy our own power and augmenting our own power supply from private suppliers and adding that to our local city grid so that we can beat so-called load shedding. We've also made it easier for households, families, and businesses to invest in renewable energy themselves, to invest in solar power. And we are the first city in the whole African continent to buy that excess power back from families and businesses and to pay them cash for it if they want to be paid for the excess power that they sell us. We've also enabled what is called wheeling across our city grid, where we allow two companies to use our city grid to sell power from one to the other without us being involved in that transaction at all, other than them paying us a small fee to use, to wheel the electricity across our grid. So we are doing everything that we can to incentivize and help the investment in more private power generation in our city grid. So we want to show the rest of the country that you do not need to accept that these failures, these reversals are permanent or irreversible, that you can do something about it. We're also making great strides in trying to deliver affordable housing and accommodation options in well-located parts of Cape Town by releasing parcels of city-owned land to what we call social housing developers, essentially affordable apartments that people can rent at a very affordable rate. And in so doing, we are really trying to speed up the process of dismantling the spatial legacy of apartheid by allowing people who are working class or who have never been able to live close to work opportunities previously to actually do that for the first time. We're also the only city in the country that runs a really world-class bus service. At the moment, it is quite small, but we are busy expanding it into new areas across the city. And we are arguing strongly, this was another part of our topic for discussion today, we are arguing strongly that our passenger rail service, which is currently another one of those monolithic state-controlled services in South Africa, state as in the national state, even though it runs through our city, we have no say in the management of it or operations of it at all, that should be formally devolved down to the city government so that we can run a proper integrated public transport system and get those trains working properly, which they sadly are not doing right now. That is critical to connecting more people with work opportunities. The work that we are doing in all of these areas will ensure that Cape Town is ready to face the future, even when urbanization and population growth ramps up and we see that city of 10 million people rushing up at us in the windscreen. Our mission is to build Cape Town into a city of hope for all, a place of dignity, safety, and economic opportunity, so that every person who lives and works there has the reasonable prospect of prosperity in the future, and so that they can feel confident again about the future of South Africa. Our project is not only a city project, it is a national project. We want every single person who sees what is happening in Cape Town, whether you live in Cape Town or not, to feel that we are doing our utmost to achieve the dream that was set out for South Africa when we did the democratic transition in the early 90s. So it's not a mission limited to Cape Town. It's also not a mission limited to my term of office as mayor. When we talk about being a city of hope, we actually specifically mean for Cape Townians 10, 20, or even more years from now. So to do this, you need to know what is coming your way, what the future holds for your city. And that is why we have invested in our future planning and resilience team. And once you have a clear understanding of what is headed your way, you need to be prepared to take decisions now to embark on long-term projects to prepare for that future, even if the benefit of those projects aren't felt in your term of office or even in both of your terms of office if you choose to run again. So projects that will outlive you and outlive your administration. It reminds me of the words of that famous proverb that our job is to plant trees in whose shade you will never sit. That is precisely what we're trying to do in the city of Cape Town, to make sure that it is a successful city for generations to come and that it can show the country and the world that all of the rightful and understandable concern about South Africa and about its future, that there is a different model, a different future, attainable, achievable, and that we are demonstrating that in Cape Town. It has been my pleasure to spend this time with you, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mayor Hill-Lewis. Accept our virtual applause. You've definitely given us a lot to think about and a lot of issues to discuss. Right now, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Mark Kennedy, who is the director of our Harbour Institute for Strategic Competition. Mark has led at the highest levels of academia, government, and business. Mark has also served as a US congressman and as a presidentially appointed member of the Advisory Committee for Trade Policy and Negotiations. Right now, we are pleased to have him leading our Harbour Institute for Strategic Competition. Mayor, we have a lot of questions that have come in from our online audience. I actually have a couple of questions for you as well. So I'm going to pause on my own questions just to make sure that we get questions from the audience. So before I come over to you, Mark, I actually want to take one question that is asking on clarification from a point that you made, Mayor, about semigration. And this comes from a colleague at the State Department who's asking if you could provide some more context on that term, explain further semigration, and who are the individuals who are moving to Cape Town? Where are they coming from? So if you could elaborate on that point further.
Sure. Well, we tend to differentiate between urbanization, which is obviously the movement of people from rural areas to the cities, and semigration, which is the movement of people from one city to another in the country. And I'm not sure whether we've coined that, but it's become a very popular phrase in South Africa. So we have seen that Cape Town has been the biggest, by far and away, the biggest beneficiary of semigration. Overwhelmingly, that has come from the cities in what we call the Gauteng region. It's a province in South Africa. And that the biggest city that most people would know there is Johannesburg, but there's a couple of other cities in that province, the capital Pretoria or Tshwane. And we've seen a lot of people, as public services have come under increasing pressure and have shown signs of fragility there, we've seen a lot of people coming south to Cape Town as semigrants. We've also seen some from Durban and, of course, from other parts, from other smaller towns across the country. At the moment, it's very, very significant. So, for example, I'll give you one anecdote. Recently, I realized that we had a great source of data that we had never previously used. Whenever someone moves to the city, usually they buy a property. If they rent a property, we don't know about them. But if they buy a property, they get a new account number from the city of Cape Town. We issue them a property tax account. And of course, in South Africa, it's much more popular, much more traditional to buy a property than to rent. I think that's a key difference between here and there. So I realized we were issuing all these brand new account numbers, and we could actually start to get an idea of how many people were coming to, as semigrants, were coming to our city. And so we started issuing a little welcome note, a little kind of love letter from the mayor's office to everyone who was new to Cape Town and who was getting a brand new city tax account number. And we've been tracking exactly how many of those welcome packs have been going out on a monthly basis. And we are, on some months, sending out as many as 3,000 a month. So a huge number of people coming to our city and buying property for the first time, just to give you an idea of the scale.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you so much. Mark, let me come over to you. So with WISC, this program that you run seeks to shape conversations around strategic competition. What is the significance of Africa's growing urban centers to the ongoing discussion on strategic competition? You're on mute. There you go.
I would say it's very profound. When you think about the very significant growing urban centers, we may focus in strategic competition in the near term more on how do we deter aggression against Taiwan and Southeast Asia, or how do we diversify supply chains. But the urban centers in Africa, I would suggest, are center stage for the contest over long-term economic and technological leadership. You know, when you consider the UN projections for population growth, UN is projecting that the population in Asia and in Latin America will be less at the end of the century than it is today. That Europe's population will be 20% less. Ours might be 20% more. But overall, if you look at outside of Africa, the world is going to have less population at the end of the century than it does today. But in Africa, you already heard Ambassador Green say it's going to go from 1.5 to 2.5 in 2050. But the UN is projecting it would be 4 billion by the end of the century. So that all of the world's growth for the remainder of the century occurs in Africa. And with the rapid urbanization, you're going to see a dramatic increase in population. So there's two compelling reasons why America really needs to wake up and take notice of African cities. One, I would suggest, might be driven by fear, the other by the pursuit of opportunity. If African cities don't become generators of opportunities for their nations, then the prospects for unrest with their young population or mass migration just escalates. On the flip side, helping to support that vibrant, smart African urban areas that generate economic opportunity for Africans is really one of the biggest commercial prospects for exports in the decades ahead. And it's not too far-fetched to say that whether that's American and Western technology or Chinese and Russian technology is going to really determine who leads economically and technologically. So helping those fast-growing urban areas in Africa is of strategic importance in our competition.
Thank you very much, Mark. Well said. And I'm going to go to another question that we have. This comes from Jack Goldstone, who works very closely with our environmental and climate change and security program here at the Wilson Center. So, Mayor, you spoke about some of the challenges in governance and at the local level, at the city level. And this question from Jack is seeking to ask, how you propose to reduce crime, which we know is casting a shadow over many South African cities. What are the strategies in place in Cape Town?
Thank you very much. So just a bit of important context here for those who may not follow this detail, totally understandable if you don't. In South Africa, we have only one police service. It is a national police service, and it is entirely run by the national government. And that is one of the things that we are working to devolve as well. We would like more localized control over the police service. Major cities are allowed to have a metropolitan police force with some limitations on its power. It's not an investigative force. It is basically a street enforcement force and traffic enforcement force. And we do have a large metropolitan police force in Cape Town. And so what we've tried to do is say, what can we do with the resources we have where we are? We don't have control over the main police force in South Africa, the main investigative power. We don't have those main investigative powers, but we do have this limited metropolitan police force. So let's use it. The other key piece of context you need is that, and this is not unique, I understand that this is quite common to cities that have large drug gangs, like South American cities and like some American cities as well, that there's a great divide in crime statistics, that crime statistics are very geographically concentrated in those areas where gangs are active. And that is absolutely true in Cape Town as well. Now, that's an opportunity because if you have limited resources, which we definitely have, you want to be able to focus them where the problem is most severe. And we have done that. In Cape Town, we have focused our municipal policing forces in the 10 police precincts where violent crime is the worst in the city. And we have actually demonstrated success by just sheer concentration of resources. So while violent crime is unfortunately ticking up in South Africa, it's actually ticking downwards in Cape Town. Still far too high. Please don't get me wrong, far, far too high. But ticking downwards, we've demonstrated a working model that you can actually, through concentration of resources, by focusing where the data says the problem is worst and where you can have the most impact, and by boxing smart with limited resources, that you can make a difference. So our impact is very focused on those 10 worst police precincts. It's very focused on street enforcement. As I said, we would love to be able to extend that to actual investigation and prosecution, which really is the thing that's going to make the biggest difference to crime in South Africa. And we are working pretty hard and advocating pretty hard to have some of those additional powers devolved to the city in the years ahead.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mayor. Mark, let me come back to you. The point about infrastructure development has come up in Ambassador Green's opening remarks and in the remarks from Mayor Hill-Lewis as well. It is obvious that a lot of African cities are punching above their own weight when it comes to trying to address the vast infrastructural needs of their communities. What, if any, opportunities exist for U.S. government and or private or public companies, U.S. companies, to partner with African cities and local governments to address a lot of the urban infrastructure gaps that we see in cities like Cape Town and others across the continent?
Well, there are many opportunities that we can engage with our African partners to do that. But interestingly, you've heard the mayor talk about many of the areas where, when you look at World Bank reports or African Development Bank reports, that are the real stumbling blocks that are keeping cities from advancing in the way they need to. For example, the African Development Bank says we need to do a better job of, as the mayor described, devolving more authorities to the city and to the counties who are closer to it so that they have the ability to do that. They also need to have the ability to have that pipeline. The mayor spoke about a pipeline of projects. When you don't have the stability of governance and moving back and forth from one leadership to another, and you don't do that planning, you don't have a coordinated way of engaging with the city. And the World Bank is saying that most African cities are too unconnected with little pockets of communities. And they also need to do a better job of helping with land purchases and defining those private property rights. I don't know that we really have a government agency as focused in helping in these areas as we can. When you think about smart cities, America also has a lot to offer in the technology area, whether you're talking Cisco, IBM, Microsoft, Honeywell, Johnson Controls, and countless other small companies. But they are really an add-on to the big projects. And so the question is, if you have a Chinese contractor building the project, they're likely to be Huawei, ZTE, Hikvision, instead of the ones I just mentioned. So whether or not those smart cities enable governments to empower their citizens or control them really hangs on the balance as to whether or not it's U.S. and Western companies that are moving forward. The other challenge we have, besides not having upstream focus, is that the big global contractors aren't American. If you look at Engineering News list of the top 20 global contractors, 15 of them are Chinese, 3 are French, 1 are Spanish, and 1 Austrian, and none from America. Yes, Bechtel and Fluor are big, but China's are even bigger. And so we need to do a better job of having either our contractors develop global partnerships around the world or partner more frequently with the French and the Spanish and the other contractors and the European agencies that they support if we're going to meaningfully help put U.S. and Western technology empowering cities that empower their cities. So these are just some of the challenges we face in being a real, even stronger player in helping African urban areas develop.
Mm-hmm. So, Mark, just to follow up on that, you said we do not have, there currently isn't an agency that exists that can coordinate these types of partnerships between cities Do you think it would be beneficial if there was an agency like this? And what do you think it could look like, given all the different agencies we already have?
I'm clearly not as familiar with USAID as the ambassador. I'm sure they're doing something in this area, but when you think about our Development Finance Corp, they can only act on something when a private company comes to them and wants help financing. Most everything else we do is at the transactional level, and even the planning areas for transactions like the Global Infrastructure Facility or U.S. Trade and Development Agency that help plan for a project are still not upstream enough. State Department does some, but one idea is we have the Millennium Challenge Corporation that creates a compact for meeting standards of democracy and taking care of your citizens. We know what it takes to create stronger, more vibrant cities. Perhaps we need a Millennium Challenge Corporation type of a compact with cities and nations that will empower their cities, that will do long-term planning, that will stick to that long-term planning. And those types of ideas is perhaps another way we could take an MCC model and apply it to urban areas in a highly beneficial way for both those cities and American future sales.
Thank you so much, Mark. We have so many questions and very little time. So I'm going to try and see how I combine some of these questions. So we have two questions that are sort of related here. One from someone at the Water Research Foundation, and then someone from Wits University. So they basically ask you to elaborate further on question on climate change, particularly rising sea levels. What is Cape Town doing to plan around these issues? And then also to talk further about the city's ability to provide sustainable drinking water and sanitation services to a growing population. I know you referenced this a bit in your remarks, but if you could just elaborate further before I go to the other questions.
Those are great questions. Thank you for those. So I often say Cape Town is not thinking about how to, or planning about how to, or even theorizing about how to deal with climate change. We are dealing with it at the coal face, perhaps more so than many other cities around the world. We've already had the experts tell us once in 600-year drought in the late 2010s, 2017 and around there, which brought us to the brink of running out of fresh drinking water. We have already begun to deal with rising storm surges. Right now, as I said, we are not planning for building coastal defenses. There is a construction project taking place in my city right now to build coastal defense walls on the western coast of the city. It might be a small project to start with, but we foresee many more projects like that, building coastal defense barriers for rising storm surges. We are embarking on what, when it's complete, it will be the biggest water reuse project, single water reuse project in the world. Learning from the excellent examples of places like Singapore and Perth and other cities around the world, which are already well down the road of perfecting water reuse. We are starting down that track to make sure that we do not have to rely on declining rainfall in the decades ahead, and that we are not susceptible to the same kind of enormous, devastating drought that we had back in 1718. So we are really dealing with the consequences of climate change, particularly in water and oceans right now. We are also, as I said, we've got a huge project to stop those blackouts. The ancillary, the primary objective of that project is to stop the blackouts, of course, but the ancillary benefit is that all of that investment is in renewables. There's no fossil fuel power in any of the projects we are currently engaging in to stop those blackouts. So we're reducing our reliance on coal energy dramatically in the city over the years ahead. So all of this really, I think, puts us at the forefront globally. I'm sure that there are other cities dealing with this at the coalface. Of course there are. We're not unique, but you will struggle to find a city that is dealing with it more directly and proactively, and which has already felt the consequences thereof and is moving to try and protect itself for the decades ahead.
So thank you so much. And I want to apologize in advance because there are several questions here. So to the members of the audience who sent these questions, I apologize. We will not be able to get to all of them. And I have two final questions that I'm going to close us out with, Mayor. So one comes from Tony Carroll, who is a member of the Wilson Center Africa Advisory Board. And his question is in regards to US-South Africa relationships. Could you discuss the impacts of PEPFAR and AGOA on Cape Town and the Western Cape? And a final question from me as you round up is, why should US policymakers pay more attention to urban cities in Africa?
So let me say to all of those who've asked questions that I haven't been able to answer, the team from Wilson is welcome to send those through to me, and I'll happily just answer you directly on email. Then Tony Carroll is a great friend of Cape Town and does a wonderful job flying the Cape Town flag and the South Africa flag actually around the world, and you know has played a seminal role in building one of the most successful industry conferences. It's called the Mining Indaba, which takes place in a few weeks, the biggest mining conference in the world, I think, in Cape Town. And he's right to promo those two programs. I don't think enough Americans know about PEPFAR and AGOA. People here in this audience, because they are very well in, this is a very well informed and well read audience, but the American state should talk about this more often. PEPFAR is a US government relief program aimed at addressing in particular HIV/AIDS and some other health emergencies on the African continent. Does incredible work. It mainly works in rural areas in South Africa, but even in Cape Town does extraordinary work working on HIV/AIDS and also on tuberculosis, and has been incredibly successful. You know, when I grew up, HIV/AIDS was considered a death sentence, and we have really turned the tide on HIV/AIDS being a death sentence in Africa and in South Africa, with many hundreds of thousands of people on permanent treatment and able to live full and productive lives, thanks in very large part to the work of PEPFAR. And then the African Growth and Opportunity Act, or AGOA, is a piece of trade legislation, or a piece of a kind of foreign policy legislation, which gives African countries access to the American markets on very, very preferential terms. And South Africa has been by far and away the biggest user and beneficiary of AGOA. And there are many companies in Cape Town who have set up and made a success of selling products into the American market. And just to give you an example of how it benefits both parties, I've personally seen a business in Cape Town start and do incredibly well out of AGOA in Cape Town. It has actually opened up manufacturing facilities in America. They've done so well. They've opened up facilities right here, born out of AGOA, and have built that success. So both of those are great projects that I think really more Americans should know about and should feel proud of.
Well, thank you so much. We are currently at time now, and I really want to express my gratitude to you, Mayor Geordin Hill, for a very fruitful discussion. I hope we will have the opportunity to invite you back to the Wilson Center. Obviously, this conversation, this discussion on Africa's growing cities is one that we anticipate following more on within the Africa program and the Wilson Center in general. So we look forward to inviting you back for this
Thank you.
conversation. Also, Mark, thank you so much for your insightful comments, and Ambassador Mark Green as well, who is no longer with us, but the opening remarks were very, very insightful. Lastly, I really want to thank everyone who joined us for this conversation. Please stay tuned for more on this discussion on Africa's growing cities. And if you want to continue the conversation, you can also follow us online through our different social media handles on Africa Up Close. Thank you so much, and everyone, please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.